Good evening and welcome to another webinar on Hangouts on Air. Tonight I'm joined by David Newsum, and while David's introducing himself, I'm going to load up tonight's presentation.
Right, thanks Steve. David Newsum, borrowed computer, Salford in the dark with a red light. I'm not sure what that means, but anyway, here I am. I'm a freelance consultant and I've produced this video for you, a short overview of Campylobacter, and then we can have a discussion about where we are in 2015 with it. So I'll hand back over to you, Steve, to play the video.
Okay, we'll give it a go. Now I should be on there. Right.
Well, hello. My name is David Newsum, and I'm very pleased to present this short summary about the current positioning of Campylobacter in 2015 for a Google Hangouts hosted by Steve Pepper Associates. I've based this short presentation and the discussion afterwards on content extracted from the FSA website, and it's March 2015. Well, it certainly presents a big problem to us, Campylobacter. The estimates at the moment are around 280,000 cases occur in the UK every year, putting it as the leading cause of bacterial food poisoning without a doubt. And very sadly to relate that maybe over 100 deaths a year are caused by this. And the majority of these cases are, as one might expect, come from contaminated poultry. And the indications are that the majority of the poultry supply is contaminated with this organism. And even looking at the overall costs of 900 million, it's certainly a significant economic problem as well as an illness and fatalities problem. So with those 280,000 cases of food poisoning each year, Campylobacter is by far and away the greatest single cause of food poisoning that we're looking at. Whilst other organisms still cause significant numbers, as you can see, this is way ahead of the other organisms that we commonly quote in food hygiene training. And Salmonella is much lowest. These figures are not just the recorded cases, they're also estimates from community research as to the true incidence of these illnesses. There are some basic facts here for Campylobacter in terms of the symptoms and some of the severe actions that can occur because, of course, Campylobacter is a low infective dose organism. Again, like most food poisoning bacteria, young children and those over 60 are at a greater risk. And although many people do recover within a few days, the severe infections can be so bad that hospitalization and antibiotics are needed. The Standards Agency has seen this as such a severe threat that it has a specific campaign called Acting on Campylobacter Together, and this is an attempt to bring the whole of the food chain into a concerted effort to reduce Campylobacter infections, and the website is well worth a view, and there are plenty of documents there to study in your own time. There's a very public-facing campaign, which last year was at the heart of Food Safety Week. A very simple comment, but in the home, preventing people from washing raw chickens could reduce contamination risks severely. And some of these pieces of advice that are very simple and straightforward can also be used in small food businesses and catering businesses who perhaps haven't thought about it or even understood it very well themselves. On the industry side, there has since December 2010 been a joint action plan, and you can see from these bullet points that they attempt to apply the controls right across the food industry and at all the critical points to try and reduce infections as far as possible. And much more detail on the FSA website about this and about all the experiments. You can see all the trials here, attempts to try different things to try and reduce this contamination, because Campylobacter is quite a complex organism and we don't know enough about it to know exactly how we might control it. In some ways one might argue that Campylobacter is the new Salmonella, and if we go back 30 years the same kind of questions would have been asked of Salmonella then. The way that we measure and look at success is basically about by measuring how many birds are in the highest category of infection. So if you goes back to 2010, it was viewed that 27% of all birds were highly contaminated. And the target that was set for this year, 2015, was to reduce that down to 10%. The reason for making these kind of calculations is to predict that if we were able to achieve that, then we would directly affect the number of Campylobacter food poisoning cases. Well, this is 2015, of course, so during this year we're looking for indications and figures that we might have achieved that particular target. And in the last year or so, the Food Standards Agency has been carrying out retail surveys on levels of Campylobacter on chicken, and you may have seen some of those reports in the headlines recently. And the whole surveillance program from February and November last year and continuing now is to attempt to provide those figures to see how we're doing. What's really interesting here is that while 73% of chickens did test positive for the presence of Campylobacter, in fact it was only 19% that had the highest band of contamination. Slightly more worrying in some cases that 7% of the packaging tested positive itself for the presence of Campylobacter. That's quite an emotive comment, although one has to bear in mind that only 3 out of over 3,000 samples of packaging actually had a very, very high level of contamination. Well, now, very recently, Marks and Spencers have carried out some determined efforts in their business as an experiment, really, to try and look at what happens when you apply a range of interventions at the same time. So they've set about 5 specific interventions. You can see those there on the slide. Throughout industry, again, from incentivizing farmers, reducing the amount of thinning that goes on in the flocks so that flocks stay together for longer rather than introduce biosecurity risks. Trying some blast surface chilling to try and reduce the amount of contamination growth, labeling foods much better so that consumers know what to do, and double bagging experiments so that the consumer doesn't actually have to remove the final bag on a chicken because that can be put straight into roast. So this is the Marks and Spencers 5-point plan. And although a complex graph, their first reports are suggesting that they are having an effect. If you look at the left-hand graph, that's August, September and October in 2014, before the plan, levels of contamination high, medium and low. And then the second graph on the right-hand side is the results after the plan has been put into place. And you can see, generally speaking, that there's an increase in the green area, which is less than 100 organisms per gram. So well done, Marks and Spencers, for experimenting on that, and I'm sure other retailers will look at it with great interest. So that's a short summary. It's only a short presentation about the key issues about Campylobacter. I look forward now to closing the presentation off and continuing our discussion on Google Hangouts. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, David. That was excellent. Nice piece of work. So, how are you going to use this information on your training?
Well, I knew you were going to ask me that question. I think, I don't know about you, I'm still battling a little bit with the lack of people having heard the name. Salmonella is so ingrained in food handlers' psyche from 30 years that Campylobacter is still a bit of a shock, really. I think the latest figures from the supermarket shelves is the lead-in, because the names are recognisable, aren't they? And although I'm not being fair, but by saying the Asda's and Tesco's and Marks and Spencers have got the same problem that the Aldi's and whatever have, I think that sort of high street reference shows that Campylobacter is here, and it's here to stay unless we can all do something about it. So it's a good in to use those current results of the tests that have been taken. That's how I'd introduce it, and then I'm hoping that my learners will say, well, what's this Campylobacter? Why is it different? And then you get into the scary bit, don't you, about 100 or 200 bacteria will make you ill, and they can be life-threatening diseases. you create that excitement, and then you look at how easy it is to transfer Campylobacter through cross-contamination, and you should have it in the palm of your hand.
Yes, I think that most people mix it up, if they've heard of it, they mix it up with food poisoning rather than being a foodborne disease.
Yeah.
And again, you know, they don't need the multiplication. One of the things I do on my training is, as I'm talking about all the different pathogens out there, I get them to imagine a chicken leg, a large chicken leg that they've slung on the barbecue on a Friday night. Open the can of lager, and it's sat there, and you ask them what happens, and they say, well, obviously it gets dark on the outside, gets burnt, and it's still pink on the inside. So I say, well, okay, if that was a fresh chicken straight out of the fridge, are you going to get salmonella? Because there's no time for it to multiply. So they'll all say, no, well, you wouldn't. But when you then ask them about Campylobacter, once you've explained it, they suddenly realise that that pink bit in the middle might contain more than 200 or 500 or whatever the numbers are these days. So that's one thing that I currently use to try and ram it home, that thorough cooking of chicken is vital.
I think we ought to. I think also it's nice to be able to counterbalance it with good old cross-contamination, because in the last 15 years, I think we've been pushed into a scenario where temperature control has been everything. You know, the arguments in the 1990s to 1995 as to whether your fridge should be 5 degrees or 8 degrees were rife. But actually, what we've lost is the fact that good old cross-contamination is where Campylobacter thrives. And those, I don't know how you play those games on your courses where you look at people transferring the gel from hand to hand and then get the UV light on. And I think we should do that with the raw chicken.
Yeah, I think you're right. We've got some like the gel, but it's very expensive. I bought a litre of the stuff. It was about 200 quid for a litre. So I've also found, just on that cross-contamination, I'll have to dig it out next time. On the UV lights, the ones with the strip light on are okay, but they're not very strong. And there's a new breed of UV lights out there for any trainers who are watching this. Cost about £1 each, with about 7 LEDs in, and they're really, really bright. They really do shoot the gel. So there's no reasonable cost why people can't use these.
Yeah, yeah. I think I'm going to start bringing a raw chicken into my training rooms and ask, is anybody prepared to handle it? After I show the results that 7% of packaging is contaminated with Campylobacter, and ask them would they like to take a gamble on picking it up and then eating a sandwich afterwards? I mean, you've got to get people into, my view, and training course, into making decisions, because what we're trying to do is teach them to make decisions. So I think you should make them make decisions in the middle of the course.
Yeah, I used to do one with raw chicken where I would have some raw chicken that I would cut up, which was coated in dye, and then I would use a single steel to sharpen the knife, and some salt and pepper, and J-cloths, of course, which are easily contaminated. And we would sort of make the chicken. I'd make them tell me what I needed to do before I started work. So put your white coat and hat on, take your jewellery off, take your watch off, go and wash your hands. So on the first time, after I'd done the raw chicken, I say, right, we will now put that in imaginary fridge. And then I'd try and just wash my hands with a clean cloth and stay off and go and do the sandwich now. And they'd also, oh no, you've got to wash your hands. So I'll go and wash my hands, but I wouldn't dry my hands. My hands would come out soaking wet. And that is a point that people miss when you're training, that wet hands transfer bacteria much more quickly than dry hands. Yeah. So I'd then come back and I'd open the sandwich up, and I'd put the same salt and pepper that I had just seasoned the raw chicken with, and there's all the dye around the top of the necks. Then before I actually use the knife, I would sharpen it with the same steel. And I could nearly guarantee, after the first few times I'd done it, I could guarantee that would transfer over to the chicken. And then I would get some cucumber and slice that down and put little twists on the sandwich. Now the thing about the cucumber, it's wet, and that also makes the bacteria stand up. And then we would hand the sandwich round and would show them all the UV lights and where it was. And of course, there wasn't it was heavily contaminated on the red board, but on the yellow one, where there shouldn't have been any, it was still contaminated. We also got on the point that we would get them to smell the sandwich, and it was usually a ham or a beef sandwich or something like that. And of course, you can't smell salmonella or Campylobacter. So that was another point to get over, that's the difference between spoilage organisms and food poisoning pathogens. And I don't do it so much anymore because we tend not to have as much time, because we tend to do a half-day course with distance learning, and that doesn't leave as much time as I would like. But we've got to find ways and means of using, as you say, bringing in chicken. I've thought for years about bringing a rubber chicken in, but I've not got any particular idea about how to do that. So between that and the story about the barbecue, it's how I'm currently using it.
Yeah. So what did you think of the Marks and Spencer's stuff that's just been released, the 5-point plan?
I think that's brilliant. That's brilliant. You know, that they're actually being very, very proactive and trying to deal with a very difficult problem. I mean, of course, it starts off at the farm, and I mean, years ago, I used to work for a turkey producer, and they had some problems of cross-contamination and keeping the flocks separate. The catching gang couldn't come in the factory, and vice versa. And it was all trying to keep on top of it. I believe the Food Standards Agency back in the early 2000s back in about 2001, 2002, had a 5-year plan then to eradicate it or to reduce it. Well, that seemed to have gone off the boil, and it didn't achieve the results.
Oh, well, this one's not quite on track. The 2010 to 2015, which is due to finish this year, find out when the results come out. But I think that's why they had a meeting with all the major poultry soup producers and supermarkets about a couple of years back, and they've actually got a working group. And I think for those people who have the time, if you go on the FSA website, you can read all the minutes of all the meetings for 3 years. And I think if you pour through those, you'll recognise some very heated arguments about why on earth aren't we getting these infections down when we're applying everything to it. And that's because the research hasn't been done yet to find out all about Campylobacter, so we don't know what works. And in that, to you and me, that's probably fascinating. But to our learners, we have to be careful that we don't give the impression that none of us know what we're doing.
Well, yeah, you're right. I mean, I was indirectly involved in the Stanley Royd outbreak, because I was, at the time, I was a head chef for 3 hospitals in Bridlington. And Christine Majewski, I don't know if you remember Christine, but she was the regional, she was the environmental health officer who dealt with it, and then she became the regional NHS on the back of that. Yeah, I think John Burns was involved as well. Was it John Burns? No, I can't remember his name. Anyway, there were a couple involved. I remember Christine coming around our kitchens and checking things out, and you know, we were horrified at the time that when the investigation was completed, the standards that they'd allowed to happen in that outbreak. And of course, Edwina Curry then a few years later said it was in the eggs and all the rest of it. Yeah. But I somehow don't see that it hasn't had the same, apart from the Marks and Spencer's bags, it hasn't seemed to have had the same public impact in the press. You know, it's more hidden, as it were.
That's, I think, as we do on our Hangouts, just say what we think. I think if you look at the current food issues at the moment, we've got food integrity, Horsegate, cumin and peanuts, allergies, E. coli, norovirus, and Campylobacter. Now that's the 7 things that are hanging around.
Yeah.
And to actually get any smaller food business to think about one of them, I mean, they haven't got a business to run, haven't they? They're working 23 hours a day, and we rock up with our make sure all your staff wash their hands, right through to you have to understand all 14 allergens and list them out on a matrix. You have to have some sympathy for the food business.
Yeah, I mean, I must admit, I was in the local baker's the other day, and the poor guy, well, one of the girls behind the counter got a plaster on, but it was a fabric plaster, and he'd got a notice on the top of the counter with a meat pie, and it said gluten-free. And I thought, well, I know what's going to happen you can't have gluten-free in a bakehouse because of the distribution of flour. And I wonder whether or not he's just got a packet of gluten-free pastry and made it up.
I think so.
And of course, what about the filling? You know, what do you think beef stew it with?
Yeah.
Obviously, wheat starch. So I sort of felt for the guy because he's just sort of refurbished the place. He put a lot of time, a lot of effort, and every time I see him, he looks absolutely tired out.
Yes.
But I can see that one of these days it's gonna cop for something, and it's gonna get done, you know, through ignorance, which is a shame.
All we can do is redouble our efforts and ask people to join us on the Hangouts and to forward the YouTube videos to people. I've noticed, I just went on your website a few days ago to show my wife, and I'd forgotten that all your Hangouts are on your website as videos.
Yeah.
Went back through all of them to realise how much there was there. So well done for doing that.
There's a lot of stuff out there. One of the things, I'm just going to pull this up on a screen share, and I don't know if you've actually seen this or not, and I'm not sure how well it shows up on the screen, but that's a new Facebook group that I put on. Can you actually see it from?
Yeah, it's very visible on the screen. Yeah.
Right. Well, basically, this is Facebook, and working over the Christmas period, I mean, I teach social media, as you probably know. I do, you know, LinkedIn and whatever, but I've never used Facebook for anything other than family and friends. And I met up with some chefs groups on the web, and I started interacting, and I've got a bit of a name for myself on there now as being a bit of a dragon who, you know, every time someone posts something that's inappropriate, you know, I'm on them like a shot. And I quite often get called during the evening. People will say, oh, you know, drag out the kraken, or, you know, what was Nosferatu, I think I got called last night, to come and comment on some technical aspect of food safety. But it's been really, really good. We helped out about 200 chefs over the Christmas period, and I gave them a free copy of my allergen pack.
Yeah.
I've had 1 or 2 referrals as well, so it's worked really well for my business plan. But what we've done is we've set up a couple of groups, well, 3 actually. Set up one for this one here, which is food safety. Now, I'm not on the actual page itself, so hang on a second. So as you can see there, it's very, very interactive. That's one we posted about the cash and carry that got fined £1,200. Yeah, that was on yesterday's news. But we're getting quite a lot of comment from other people as well. And there's a young lady there been asking about using vegetables from her allotment, and she was asking if, you know, she was allowed to do that. And I looked online, all I could find was the 1922 Allotment Act, which forbids you from selling produce. But I wasn't sure if there was any registration required. Because prime production is not my field. But we've got that one, and that's specifically on food safety issues. And then we've got this one here, which is on allergens, and there's a couple of the pens there as my chart on that. Yeah. And again, that's the allergen pack that we've put on there, which I'm going to come back now.
Yeah, I've seen that.
Yeah. And then we've got one for which we've not got. We've got about 170 odd members on the chefs one. Sorry, not the chefs, on the food safety. But we've also started one which I'm hoping that people look at the webinars will join us on to share good practice on professional trainers as well. And again, you know, it's very, very early, very much in its infancy. But I just thought I'd sort of introduce that to people here.
Excellent. Well, we've exercised Campylobacter, Steve. So what's next month's topic? Have you got one in mind yet?
Well, I wonder whether or not it would be probably useful to revisit allergens, because by then we'll be into April, and I think that I mean, if you've got the time to do one, I'd be grateful if you would.
Well, I'll share the experience of training the enforcement officers as much as I'm allowed to share, which is not individual cases, but is about the difficult areas that the enforcement officers realise businesses will have in compliance.
Yeah.
In this series, very briefly, for the last 18 months, working with enforcement officers, I've been reminded how keen they are to help businesses to comply.
Which is good.
Very, very obvious in the allergens series. So I've got some good news to share there about being flexible about compliance. So I'm happy to join with you on that one. I'm just my diary though before I say that. It's first Tuesday of the month.
Yes. And without looking at my diary, I don't know what the date is. But
that will be the first Tuesday in April is the 7th.
7th, right? Okay. Well, we'll get that one in our diary. Yeah.
In my diary now.
Okay. So we'll get that one in the diary. One of the things I've been sharing from the allergen groups I've looked at, there was one on one of the allergy groups, and someone's written a top 10 tips for environmental health people to look at when they're going around. So I've actually shared with some caterers on the group, because I think that if they know what they're going to be looked at rather than trying to guess, then chances are they can get their act together before they end up in bother with anyone. So, I think that's one of the things I like about this, being able to use the site. Obviously, there's stuff that I can't share, like you, but anything that's going to help them to comply with that legislation and make it easy for them, then that's great.
Yeah.
So anyway, if you hang on when we're finished with this, there's a couple of other things I wanted to show you.
Okay.
But we'll just say good night to our viewers and to other people who may be watching this at a later date. And thank you very much once again, David. It's been great as usual.
And
okay. Good night.